How many of you are of some Scottish ancestry? How many of you wish you were? No, we'll say that. I do love Scotland. I will say next week we are coming to the Netherlands, so also a very big pull on my heart. How many of you have been to Scotland before? Probably, a good number of you. It is a wonderful place to visit, and Edinburgh, and there's a lot of other things to see, but if you just make it to Edinburgh, you can see a lot of amazing things, and maybe some of these places will have some visual in your mind. We're talking today about John Knox. This is the main biography that I used, so it's another one of these that Yale published along with the Calvin one and the Zwingli one. This is by Jane Dawson, who teaches at the University of Edinburgh. This came out a few years ago. It's a little over 300 pages, so this is the most recent scholarly biography. She's a little more critical of Knox and places than we might want, but on the whole, it's a very fair and I think very helpful biography. And to be honest, there are a lot of Knox biographies that can be a bit hagiographical. In fact, he tends to be, as we'll see, we'll understand why, a very polarizing figure, that people think either he was the greatest thing since the apostles or he was a monster and everything that is wrong with Scotland is attributable to Knox. So this is a good, fair biography. Banner of Truth recently republished the 6 volumes, The Works of John Knox. It's a facsimile edition, so it's kind of an ugly type set in the covers, but I don't know how much this costs because they sent it to me for free. So, but it's a really nicely done, and if you want to read more of John Knox, you can get this at Banner of Truth. And this is out of print, but I just checked, and you can still get used copies for relatively cheaply on Amazon. This is originally from 1960, but this is a church history of Scotland, last name Burley, who taught at the University of Edinburgh. So if you want to know all things Scottish church history, and there's lots of other good resources. How many of you have been to Geneva? That's where we were last week with Calvin. So a few, not quite as many of you, but if you've been to Geneva, you probably saw, and if you haven't, you may be familiar with the Reformation wall in Geneva. As I said, I can show you a very nice picture with Barry Peterson standing in front of it. All the great reformers, and Barry, who's a reformer in his own right. It is quite an impressive structure. Some would say it's inspiring, others would say it's intimidating. The wall, located within the University of Geneva, stretches for about 100 meters, so it's a lot longer than this room. And it has a number of statues etched into the wall, so sort of coming out like you might have Han Solo coming out of the carbonite. That's what the statues look like. And in the middle are 4 of the leading reformers, 4 men. And these statues are not dating back to the Reformation. In fact, they date back to 1909, when there was a competition to establish these statues, and or at least have the competition was, how do we commemorate in 1909 the 400th year of Calvin's birth and the 350th anniversary of the University of Geneva. And I'm glad Geneva did it in 1909, because if you would have waited to 2009, I doubt that the people in Geneva would have wanted to have built what they did. But standing 5 meters tall, so maybe that's, up to that ceiling, are 4 men, each holding a Bible, each with broad shoulders, a thick beard, and a long preaching gown. If you picture from Lord of the Rings, remember when they're sailing through, it's at the end of the first movie, and you see those big statues, and they're like this. That's really what they look like. Not quite so high, but 15 feet tall, these reformers. William Farel, John Calvin, Theodore Beza, and John Knox. At first, John Knox seems to be a curious choice to stand in the center of the Reformation wall in Geneva. For starters, the other three, Farel, Calvin, Beza, were all French. Knox, Scottish. Farel, Calvin, Beza, in successive order, were the lead ministers in Geneva. Farel was there, he got Calvin. Calvin, when he died, his successor was Beza. Knox did not have that same role in Geneva. From 1532 until 1605, those three other men dominated the religious life in Geneva. Knox was never that figure in Geneva, but as we'll hear, he was, for a time, a pastor in Geneva. He pastored an English-speaking church of exiles, so he definitely had ties to the city. And more importantly, one could argue that Knox was the most important, successful export ever to come out of Calvin's Geneva. Because of Catholic persecution in France, the French Reformed Church today is very small. We have the Foucaults doing their best over there and many others, but it's still very small. And even though the Church of Scotland has gone very liberal and Presbyterian churches are closing in Scotland, yet there is a long, centuries-long history of Reformation doctrine and heroes and churches in the land of Scotland. And from Scotland, Presbyterianism spread, and we are all, in some sense, downstream from that. And now there are Presbyterian denominations all around the world. South Korea, lots of Presbyterians. Brazil, parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And all of that, not solely attributable to John Knox, but in large measure, he is what cemented the Reformation in Scotland. So even though he is not one of those French-speaking pastors in Geneva, he was perhaps the most successful export to come out of Geneva. And as we'll see, although Knox looked up to Calvin, sometimes we don't realize this, that Knox and Calvin had a close relationship, and Knox looked up to him as a kind of father figure, as a kind of mentor, even though Calvin was probably only 5 years older than Knox. The two, though they shared the same theology, were not at all the same personality. Different gifting, different calling, different temperament. One of the lessons here is God is going to use all sorts of people, and he did in the Reformation. They shared the same assumption that the church as well as society needed to be reformed, and that meant Geneva for Calvin, and it meant Scotland for Knox. And yet, Calvin had gifts of administration and organization that Knox didn't have. And for all that Calvin did in Geneva, and really was in his lifetime, you might say, more successful at reforming efforts than Knox was, yet in the Lord's providence, the Reformation stuck around a lot longer in Scotland than it did in Geneva. In a way, the four men at the center of the Reformation wall, of all of them, Knox has more immediate ecclesiastical descendants. That is to say, there are fewer descendants from French Protestantism in the world, certainly, than there are descendants from Scottish Presbyterianism. So who was John Knox? He was born, and it used to be thought that he was born in 1505. Now, most scholars think he was born in 1514, though we don't know for sure. John Knox was born in East Lothian in Haddington. Actually, it's the same place, you'll be glad to know. The same area where John Witherspoon was born. No, we're not going to have a whole lecture on John Witherspoon. Have to wait for the book to come out someday. And John Witherspoon was a descendant on his mother's side, actually, from John Knox. He was born in Haddington, which is about 20 miles east of Edinburgh. Later in life, he would sometimes use the Latin title Tinaterius, T-I-N-O, Tirius, which means on the banks of the Tyne. The Tyne River flows through Haddington in the eastern part of Scotland. We know very little about Knox's childhood. He probably had many siblings, but all we know about is his older brother William. And at some points, when he needed something of an alias, he would use the name John Sinclair. So most scholars think that was his mother's maiden name and came from a very well-connected Scottish family, the Sinclairs. And I've been taught many times, though I still probably can't get it right, that Sinclair Ferguson's name is not Sinclair, it's Sinclair. So I don't know, you just have to, that's the Scottish way. But he's very gracious to let us call him Sinclair. In his prime, John Knox was short and stocky. So a shout out to all the short and stocky brothers here. You don't have to raise your hands and self-identify. He had black hair, a dark, swarthy complexion, deep blue eyes. After he left the Catholic Church, because when you were a priest in the Catholic Church, you were supposed to be clean-shaven, but once you left that, so many of them grew these thick beards, which covered his long, angular face down to his chest. Though later in life he was often sick, as most people were back then, Knox at his prime was strong, a manly sort of man, broad shoulders, a face that could flash with intensity. If you think of someone in the pictures of him, this is the most famous, though this wasn't given in his lifetime, but this is him, if you can see this, preaching in St. Andrews, and you can see he's flying over the pulpit and would pound the pulpit, and whether that's what it looked like, he did preach like that. So he cut a rather intimidating figure. You can see this one. And he looks like he's about to cast a wizard spell somewhere in Middle-earth or something. But he grew a thick beard when he sided for the Reformation. He likely started out in school at St. Mary's in Haddington, which was at time the largest parish in Scotland, and then he went in his mid or late teens to the University of St. Andrews, which is just due north, not terribly far from Edinburgh. He studied under a man named John Mayer, not that John Mayer, also sometimes given as John Major, who was one of the leading scholastic teachers of the day. So he got to study under one of the great late medieval academics. One of the things that John Major was known for was what we call conciliarism. It's a long term. What it means is coming out of the late Middle Ages, there was a debate because the popes were always fighting with who was the real pope, and there was a pope in France and there was a pope in Rome, and a theory developed that the pope really should be subservient to church councils. So conciliarism means councils, that the councils should have the backstop, the final authority in the church. And this was one of the ideas that John Major trumpeted, and it's quite possible that from an early age, even when Knox was still in the Catholic Church, he had something of this anti-papal, at least less than enthusiastic about the papacy idea instilled in him. Now, comparing with some of the men we've looked at already, unlike Calvin and Cranmer and Zwingli, Knox did not have that humanist education. Remember, not secular humanism, but this new theology, this new way of doing education that went back to the sources, back to the Greeks and the Romans and the Greek and the Hebrew. He did not have this humanist education. It may be one of the reasons that Knox, though we have 6 volumes of his works, he was not a major theological player around Europe in his lifetime. He wrote several things. His most significant treatise was A Defense of Predestination, and people read them, but it's more what he did. People today are not in the same way reading what Calvin or what Luther wrote. He did not have the same humanist education. But from early on, everyone could see he excelled as a speaker and a debater. He was a good writer too. And probably more by default than anything, he pursued a career in the church. What do you do if you're one of the very few men who get to go to university? Of course, women weren't going to university. If you're a man who goes to a university, you probably you've gotten some kind of break in life or some sort of privilege. And what do you do, as we've already seen? Well, it's probably law or the church. And so he opts for a career in the church. In 1536, he is ordained as a deacon and then as a priest in the Catholic Church. And sometime before 1540, he becomes a notary. Do we have any notaries in the crowd? Any? Because I'd like you to sign something later. He was a notary, which today is, you go to the bank or the DMV and somebody can sign something for you. Here it was kind of like a county lawyer. And because the church had control of almost the whole apparatus of society, it was a function of the church. So he's ordained as a priest, and then he works as a lawyer, a county lawyer, a notary. So he's doing what you would expect. He's signing documents, and he's giving official acclamation to things, and he has a fairly comfortable career in the church, even if his work was really more legal than it was and procedural than theological or spiritual. So he could have settled in and done what many men in his position would have done and climbed the church ladder and have, at least for the standards of the day, a fairly comfortable life. By 1543, he's still this papal notary, but his life was about to be transformed from a faithful, unknown Roman Catholic priest to a fiery Protestant preacher. Well, what happened? Well, a number of things happened. First, in 1543, Knox has his first encounter with Lutheran preaching. Now, we think Lutheran is this whole tradition, but here it just means the descendants of Luther and Luther's ideas in preaching. So 1543, Luther dies. I forget if it was 45 or 46. So at the end of Luther's life, he begins to hear this Reformation preaching. And he becomes convinced of justification by faith alone. And then he sets out to study the scriptures for himself, and he embraces more of the Protestant ideas, sanctification and regeneration and the authority of the Bible above all else and union with Christ. And of particular importance, somewhat surprisingly for John Knox, is the chapter of Jesus' high priestly prayer, John 17. Later, when he lays dying in bed and he asks his wife to read the scriptures to him before he passes, she reads John 17, and he says about John 17 that it was the place where, quote, I cast my first anchor. It's the place where he first really put down roots in the gospel of the Reformation. The next step in his conversion and his call to Protestant ministry comes, and it's not often we can give these precise dates, but here we can on December 13, 1545. And again, I apologize, only half of you can see what's on this board. 1545. So what happened? Well, this was the first time that he heard the Scottish preacher George, I think you say his name, Wizard, or you can see there Wiseheart, but George Wizard. He was a well-known Reformed preacher in Scotland, an evangelical. At one time, he was called the stiff-necked Scot. Yeah, maybe a bit of a redundancy there, but the stiff-necked Scot who had returned from traveling in England and Switzerland and Germany back to Scotland. Now, this is not in my notes, and forgive me if this scandalizes you, but the groundskeeper Willie character in The Simpsons is really quite humorous. I don't watch The Simpsons anymore. My parents didn't let me watch it when I was growing up. I did make up for it when I was in college. But if you've never seen Groundskeeper Willie, he is this extremely hyperbolic Scotsman. And he actually gives lots of little speeches about Presbyterianism at various points. And there's one classic scene where he sees Bart and Lisa playing out from the principal's office, and he says, "Oh, wow, brothers and sisters playing together. That's unusual." And he looks out and he says, "It's brothers and sisters getting together are like, they're natural enemies," he says, "like Scotsmen and Englishmen, like the Scots and the French, like the Scots and the Japanese, like the Scots and other Scots." Then he says, "Darn Scots, they ruined Scotland." So it's a very over-the-top, crotchety Scotsman. Well, this man, George Wishart, was not like that, but he was a fiery preacher, and his preaching tours throughout Scotland helped to popularize the doctrines of the Swiss Reformation. He was the first one to translate into English the Swiss Helvetic Confession. Remember, that comes after Zwingli died. His successor in Zurich is Bullinger. Bullinger writes the Helvetic Confession, and Wishart translates it into English. When Knox heard him preach, he was mesmerized. And it was for Knox a literal call to ministry, sort of like Jesus and the apostles, come follow me. What did it mean to follow Jesus? Well, it meant, okay, I leave my nets and I go follow you. So Knox left what he was doing, and for 5 transformative weeks, he followed George Wishart on a preaching tour throughout Scotland. And in order to get as close as he could in this band of disciples to Wishart, Knox invented a role for himself, that he would be his bodyguard. Now, it was a very dangerous thing. He was considered a heretic. It was a very dangerous thing to be preaching the doctrine of the Reformation throughout Scotland in the 1540s. So it wasn't uncalled for to have a bodyguard. And famously, Knox, and this says something about Knox's personality and his flair for the dramatic, he picked one of those two-handed giant swords. Just picture kind of like the sword in Braveheart. So he just picked this very large, double-fisted sword and walked around. Now, he was the son of a middle-class man. He went to university. He was a priest. Knox probably had no idea how to use the sword. Be like me walking around with a big gun. I don't know how to do this thing. But it did cut an imposing figure, and it maybe was something of a prop, and he never had to use it, but he fancied himself the bodyguard for the great preacher George Wishart. To Knox, he called him Master George. Nathan said he would appreciate that name also. He would be happy to be called Master George. But he was only a few years older, but Knox considered him his hero, his role model, his example of what uncompromising preaching should be like. Knox was doing something rather bold and courageous by identifying with Wishart in such a public way. Again, he has a comfortable life. He's a priest, he's a notary, and then he comes and he aligns himself very publicly as they go on this preaching tour with this known heretic, George Wishart. From that moment on, Knox knew what he was to do with his life. It wasn't to be a county lawyer signing papers. He was to be a preacher, and not just a preacher, but a prophetic voice like Wishart. And so he grew his black beard down to his chest, and he resolved, quote, to be a true messenger of God to whom the truth is revealed. And when Knox writes about Wishart, he likens him to a prophet. And the Scots are a crazy bunch sometimes. Knox heralded him as a prophet, not only for his preaching, but he thought Wishart sometimes predicted the future, actually gave prophecies that were then fulfilled. And Knox likened that he had some of those moments too, as we'll see. One of the things he also learned from Wishart was a love for metrical psalm singing. Now that sounds very snooze to us, but it was revolutionary. In fact, it was one of the chief signs. We've seen it in France, in the story of the Belgic Confession. The same thing happens. We'll see it later here in Scotland, that if you want to show that you are against the Catholic Church and you are squarely on the side of the Reformation, you sing the Psalms. It was to be the Reformation hymn book, and he learned it from Wishart. And for centuries thereafter, the Scottish churches have been known for their love of singing the Psalms. Well, it turns out that Wishart needed a bodyguard. For soon after Knox left him, Master George was captured and handed over to this man, Cardinal David Beaton. He was the main church leader in Scotland, and by some accounts, he was the main political leader in Scotland. And Beaton arranges for Wizard to be captured and arrested and handed over to him. For the rest of his life, Knox will think of this Cardinal Beaton as one of the arch enemies of the gospel. He calls him, quote, that bloody wolf, the cardinal. Beaton had Wizard brought to St. Andrews, where he was put on trial. It was a show trial. He was going to be found guilty, and he was. He was quickly condemned, and on March 1, 1546, Wizard was burned at the stake as a heretic, and his body was publicly displayed to be a lesson for all the other Protestants in the land. And Beaton looked out from his castle window in St. Andrews with approval. The death of Wizard, this great heroic preacher for the Protestants, really set Scotland on edge. On May 29, so March 1, Beaton has Wizard burned and hung on the gallows. So just a few months later, on May 29, after Wizard's martyrdom, a group of 18 men break into the castle at St. Andrews, and in his sleep, they stab and they murder David Beaton. Sometimes it's good to just be remembered. Things could be worse. This is getting worse. So the Protestants murder the murderer of their hero Wizard, and they hole up in St. Andrews and in the castle a little refugee community in Scotland, a safe haven for Protestants. In 1547, the group of people there say, we need a pastor. We're holed up here in the castle. We have some control of this little town, and we need a pastor, and they call John Knox. So John Knox was not one of the 18 men who murdered Beaton, but sympathetic. So they call Knox, and this is really the first taste that Knox has as preaching. He preaches in the castle, and then he's called to the parish church in town, and he preaches in both of those places. It's here that he first preaches the gospel. He denounces the Catholic Church and the Pope, whom he dubs as the Antichrist. He proclaims Christ alone, faith alone, grace alone. And years later, when Knox would look back on this time, he would see it as really the first time that he preached. The short ministry in St. Andrews would always be remembered as the time that he first did battle with the Antichrist and proclaimed the true gospel. So that's 1547 when Knox arrives in the castle, but his time there is short-lived as the Protestants are holed up there. The summer of 1547, a French fleet, so he's only there for a short time, months, was sent secretly by Henry II of France and sailed to St. Andrews, through the river and up to St. Andrews, and they bombarded the castle. And Knox is one of the men who's holed up in the castle. These people live very dramatic lives. On August 7, 1547, the inhabitants there at St. Andrew's Castle, including John Knox, were captured and shipped off to France. And for the next 19 months, you may not have known this about Knox, he was chained as a galley slave. So a French, part of the French fleet that would sail around the North Atlantic and around Europe, part of the French fleet, and the ships were powered typically by 150 galley slaves. You would be chained, your legs in irons, and chained to your bench. You would typically have 3 shifts of 50 galley slaves. So the men who were chained and who rowed these ships were convicted criminals, or they were prisoners of war, men like Knox and others, a rough group of men. And on this ship, you can imagine, Knox suffers great deprivation. He is a strong man, and that serves him well at this point. But for 19 months, he serves as a galley slave 150 rowers, 50 men, and to make matters worse, there are many stories of the French officers on the ship forcing the men, many of whom were Scottish, to attend Mass, and the Scottish prisoners refused to attend Mass. And then on one occasion, the story is told that they brought out an image of the Virgin Mary, and they asked for all of the galley slaves to come up and kiss the image of the Virgin Mary. And of course, John Knox refused. And the story is told that the officer put it right into his face, kissed the Virgin Mary. They put it right into his hands because Knox had said earlier that he would not even touch the thing because he considered it an idol and he would be impure. So they put it in his face, they put it in his hands, and what does Knox do once it's in his hands? He throws the image overboard. And he says, quote, "Let Our Lady now save herself. She is light enough. Let her learn to swim." According to one version of the story, the galley officers decided this is not worth the effort to get the Scotsmen to do the Catholic worship. In another version of the story, they tried to throw Knox overboard. In the spring of 1548, so he's still a galley slave, a large French fleet was assembled to sail for Scotland. As they approached land, back to his native land, Knox could see from his ship, and he was on the ship called the Notre Dame, and he could see the finest ship in the French fleet, which was called the Cardinal. And he could see through mismanagement of this ship, it got too close to the land and it ran aground and it began to break up. And when Knox saw this, the ship named the Cardinal run aground, no doubt with a smile on his face, Knox remarked, "Scotland can bear no cardinals." Later that summer, on a return trip to Scotland, Knox was so sick, everyone thought for sure he was going to die. Not unusual that you would die as a galley slave. To be condemned as a galley slave was just one half step better than being executed, and maybe it was even worse. His friend props him up because they're approaching St. Andrews. And he says, "Do you see where we are?" This is Knox, seems to be near to death. And he looks up and he sees the church spire where he had preached, and he says that no matter how weak he now appears, he makes this prophecy that he would not depart this life until he could once again glorify God and preach Christ in that very same place again. In the spring of 1549, the English government, remember now, 1549, remember what we learned with Cranmer? So by now, we have Henry VIII has died, and Edward VI, remember he's the Protestant boy king who has Protestant advisors really running the country. So in 1549, England is going through its great Protestant full-on Reformation, and the English then negotiate with the French that some of these allies, so men like Knox were allies of the Protestant cause, that they might be released. Sure enough, he was. This time, however, a year and a half as a slave would have a profound effect. We use the word trauma pretty loosely, but this would have been truly traumatic. For one thing, it meant that he was much sicklier for the rest of his life. On the positive side, it did impress upon Knox the importance of loyalty, camaraderie, male friendship, being in the trenches with people you can count on to fight the good fight. It also, for better or worse, and it was some of both, it cemented in Knox's mind what he already really had from Wizard, and that is a view of the world that was very polarized. There were good guys and there were bad guys. And if the bad guys got in power, they very well might kill you or enslave you. And you can understand why Knox thought that, because it happened to Knox. So for his whole life, he lived with a fear, and I don't mean a trembling fear, but with a suspicion of what a Catholic power might do in Scotland. And he had experienced it firsthand. He saw that the French Catholics came and bombarded him and made him a slave for a year and a half. We can divide Knox's ministry now into three somewhat distinct sections. So 3 phases now of Knox's adult ministry. The first is his ministry in England from 1549 to 1553. So when he's released in 1549, he can't go back to Scotland, but he can go to England. And he is licensed to preach by the English Privy Council, and he is sent to the border town of Berwick. It has a W in the middle, but the English don't like to say their W's in the middle of words. Berwick upon Tweed, which you look on a map, it is as close to Scotland as you can be. It's a border town. It was a garrison town, a rough town of about 3,500, far away from London, as far away as you could be from London and still be in England. It's where soldiers were and foreign mercenaries and laborers who were building the fortifications for this border town of about 3,500. And Knox was made to be the preacher. And he was successful. This is a place where Knox's fiery, stern preaching, intimidating persona worked to his advantage. People even marveled that he was able to be a sort of law and order. Remember, the pastor in these towns is pastor, preacher, sheriff. I mean, he is setting the tone, the moral tone for the whole community. This was the first place where he truly was a pastor. Later, in the same time period, he sent a little farther south to Newcastle, which you've maybe heard of before, still in northern England in 1551, and he was named one of 6 royal chaplains. This is a great honor, and it says something about the rising star that is John Knox. So if you're a royal chaplain, it means from time to time you get to go to the royal court and you get to preach for the king and for his entourage. He was one of 6 royal chaplains. He was also offered the bishopric of Rochester. So the Church of England is saying, we see something, this guy, do you want to be the Bishop of Rochester? Well, that would have been a big step up. He refuses. They also offered him an important vicarage in London. Well, that would have been a big step up from these remote places in the north, but he refused that as well. We're not sure why he did. Maybe he wanted to be closer to Scotland. Maybe he just had no interest in climbing the ecclesiastical ladder. That was part of it. And maybe he knew himself well enough to know that he was not suited for navigating political life. He was really the opposite of Cranmer, with the opposite strengths and weaknesses. So Cranmer was a consummate politician, and at times, frankly, he compromised. Knox never compromised. And yet he didn't have Cranmer's skill to try to play the long game, to be patient, to maybe bend a little in this area so that the long-term trajectory might be better. That was never Knox's strength. In 1552, he gets engaged to a woman named Marjorie Bowes, B-O-W-E-S. The Bowes were a well-to-do family. The father, Richard, who was in charge of a local castle, was not at all happy. Knox is, first of all, a commoner, and he's not keen on this Protestant faith either, and he didn't want them to get married. But still, it does seem that they fell in love, and they were betrothed, which was legally binding in that day. It wasn't just a commitment you made to each other. It was legally binding, even though it'd be 2 more years before they got married. So he gets married, engaged, not married yet, to Marjorie. Now, I need to say something, and this has caused a lot of speculation by biographers of Knox, that he had a curious relationship with Marjorie's mother, Elizabeth. I think the best evidence says that they Knox and Elizabeth did not have any physical relationship, not a romantic relationship, but even in Knox's day, there were rumors. Elizabeth wrote all sorts of letters to Knox, especially in these early years before Knox and Marjorie were married. And she was a convert to the Protestant faith. She probably looked to Knox as a pastor, a spiritual leader. Knox probably looked at, well, I'm a pastor to the flock. And he wasn't all that careful in the kind of emotional connections he was making with his future mother-in-law and then mother-in-law. To put it negatively, you might say Elizabeth was a little clingy, and you might say that Knox had a lot to learn in how to navigate relationships with women. Also keep in mind, John and Elizabeth were probably almost the same age when he was marrying the daughter, who was probably a teenager. Now that was very common that older men would marry younger women in that day. So you can understand why he might have more immediately in common with Elizabeth. It got to the point where there were rumors that something was happening, and Knox admitted later that he had been only thinking of his pastoral responsibilities and he hadn't been thinking of public reputation. Now, John and Marjorie, when they get married, have a very happy marriage, and Elizabeth would stay very close to both of them. So there's no reason to think that John and Elizabeth had a physical relationship, but it's one of those things that have raised eyebrows over the years. During this time, John Knox was instrumental. Remember, Cranmer's writing the Book of Common Prayer, and John Knox was instrumental with something. Now, the name will sound suspicious to you, but let me explain. Something in the Book of Common Prayer called the Black Rubric. Now, that sounds bad, but the issue was a debate over the Lord's Supper and the position. So Knox and many of the Scots wanted that you could sit to receive the Lord's Supper, like a meal. But the Book of Common Prayer wanted kneeling. Well, many of the Protestants said kneeling, that seems pretty Catholic. That seems like we're worshiping, which seems like we think that this is transubstantiation. So Knox got a little paragraph inserted at the last minute which explained that the kneeling was not to be taken as giving adoration to the host, and it was not to understand that it was in any way the real and essential body and blood of Christ. And it's called the Black Rubric because the regular print was in red, and this was a last-minute addition, and it was put in there in black. All told, Knox spent 4 years in England. It's where he learned to be a pastor. And even though he was a Scotsman, he always had one or at least half a spiritual foot in England. The second phase of his ministry is on the continent. So you notice that that date ends in 1553. Do you remember what happens in 1553? I'm sure you do. King Edward VI dies, which is why Knox, so is in England, a foreigner in England, flees. Almost all of the foreign Protestants leave England because 1553, the Protestant Edward VI dies. He's, 15 or 16 years old, and his half-sister, Mary, known to Protestants as Bloody Mary, becomes the queen. So England is not a safe place for Protestants. And so where does he go? If you are in Western Europe in the middle of the 16th century, and all of these countries and cities are trading back and forth between Catholic and Protestant, and you're a Protestant and your country is Catholic, where do you go? Well, the best place to go is Geneva. Although Calvin had opposition from people, it was thoroughly committed as a Reformation city. You have one of the greatest preachers and theologians everyone can see of the day. And so refugees poured into Geneva. One of the influences that Calvin had through Geneva is that so many people came there as refugees and then went out. So he went to Geneva. Now, he wasn't in Geneva for very long when he got a call to pastor an English-speaking church in Frankfurt, in Germany. He didn't really want to go. He'd prefer, I probably would too, and just study under Calvin and kind of relax a little bit. But Calvin really wanted him to go, and nudged him out the door. He thought this was a good opportunity. Frankfurt was a Lutheran city, but they made a special allowance that they would take a Reformed pastor. Calvin said, hey, this is a good opportunity. Go pastor these English exiles in Frankfurt. Well, he gets to Frankfurt, and you see again the strengths and weaknesses of Knox. This is an English church, mind you, so they're supposed to be using the Book of Common Prayer, and Knox sort of never really was totally on board with the Book of Common Prayer. Knox was not on board really with people telling him what to do and with a lot of rules around worship. Remember, even though he was in the Church of England for those 4 years, he was way up in the north. He was far away from London. He was in a rough border town. People were not looking over his shoulder to see if he did everything jot and tittle by the prayer book. He kind of could do what he wanted to do, which suits John Knox. But here in Frankfurt, he quickly runs afoul of leaders in the church who want a more strict observance to the Book of Common Prayer. And here again, we see the difference between Calvin and Knox. Now, we think of Calvin often as, he's very rigid, but Calvin actually could be much more flexible. And so Knox and his congregation are at loggerheads, and they write to Calvin, okay, Calvin, would you come in and settle this thing? They probably both want Calvin to put the hammer down and just say who's right. And what Calvin does basically say, I'm pretty frustrated with all of you. He sympathizes with Knox because, these people are holding on. They're kind of Catholic practices, and they want to kneel at the Eucharist. And, that's probably not the best. And we should get rid of that eventually. But Calvin was also frustrated with Knox. Like, can you just be a little patient? Can you just kind of let them do this for a while? It's going to take a little bit. Don't be so aggressive and so fast in getting all of these changes. And Knox was a little disappointed that Calvin didn't come down more on his side. To be accommodating was not in Knox's personality. So he gets kicked out of the church in Frankfurt. This also left a mark on Knox. It meant he had some suspicions, not only of Catholics, well, of course, but now he was sometimes suspicious people on his side might turn on him. Knox was always better suited as a kind of outsider to speak the truth, to stand courageously no matter what, than he was to be an insider who could navigate and work with the committee. Very ironic, being the first Presbyterian, supposedly he couldn't work with committees. But Calvin, he could be angry and vehement, but he did the hard slog of getting political control of things before he implemented all of his changes. So Knox is kicked out of Frankfurt. He's back in Geneva. One of Knox's supporters from the Frankfurt church set up a new exile church for English speakers back in Geneva. So Knox comes back to Geneva, and he's going to be a pastor of an English refugee church in Geneva. He pastors along with a man named Christopher Goodman, who will be his best friend. And in December of 1556, Knox wrote to his close friend Anne Locke. So it wasn't unusual that men would have close correspondence with female letter writers, and he had one with Anne Locke, no relation to John Locke as far as I know. And this is where he utters this famous statement in a letter that Geneva was, quote, the most perfect school of Christ that ever was in earth since the days of the apostles. In other places I confess Christ to be truly preached, but manners and religion so sincerely reformed I have not yet seen in any other place. Knox says, there's a lot of places around Europe right now where they have good preaching, but I've not seen any city that is reformed from top to bottom. He and Marjorie are married in this time period in 1554. They have 2 children in Geneva. When he brings them back to Geneva, somewhat scandalously, Elizabeth, the mother, goes with John and Marjorie. Some people thought, wow, this is like a Ruth to Naomi. I am choosing my faith over my husband, and she was heroic. And others, even among the Protestants, said, now wait a minute, you should not be leaving and deserting your husband. And they never met again. She left with John and Marjorie to go to Geneva. In 1557, Knox is summoned back to Scotland. He had made a brief trip there before and did some preaching rather courageously, but now he thinks he's going to go back to Scotland, but he travels up to this coastal city, Dieppe, in France, and he's there. But before he goes to Scotland, he receives word that the invitation has been rescinded, and rescinded by Mary, Queen of Scots. And so he returns to Geneva for 2 more years. During this time is where John Knox publishes his most famous or infamous work. And in order to understand the drama here, we just have 10 or 15 minutes left, you need to understand all of the Marys. This is very confusing. There are 3 Marys, they're all Catholic. So you have Mary Tudor, she's the Queen of England, she's the one who succeeds Edward VI, she's Bloody Mary, she's the one who persecutes the Protestants, so she's in England. Then you have Mary, Queen of Scots. She is, as the name gives you, she is technically the queen in Scotland. She was born in 1542. She's the daughter. She is Mary Stuart. Mary Tudor. This is Mary Stuart. Daughter of James V. She's 6 days old when her father's died. So at 6 days old, she becomes the queen. Believe it or not, you're not ready to be the queen when you're 6 days old. So she is, in the next few years, she's sent off to France to be safe. So she's sent off to France. She's betrothed at a very young age, as would happen with royalty, to the Dauphin, that is the heir apparent to the throne in France. So for all intents and purposes, she is raised as a French Catholic. She goes off to France, where she's safe and raised as a Catholic, Mary Queen of Scots, and the regent, you know that word, a regent is the person who rules in place of the king or queen when the king or queen is incapacitated or usually not old enough. So the regent, the one really on the throne, also named Mary, is Mary of Guise. Guise is a noble house from France. Mary of Guise is the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. There's also Mary DeYoung, but she doesn't come into it, and she's not Catholic. It's my daughter. So we'll just take her off, but Mary, we like Marys. So Mary of Guise is the regent in Scotland. Her daughter, who's the real queen, is off in France. Well, ever since Mary Tudor, the England, took the throne, Knox had been thinking of this question of female rulers. Should women be heads of state? And he concluded that they shouldn't. Now, it was not unusual at the time. That was not an unknown opinion. And we can understand why Knox was especially alarmed. Every Protestant was alarmed by Mary Tudor. She was killing their friends. She was persecuting the Protestants. Beginning in 1557, as Knox is rattling this notion of female leaders, female political leaders, he discusses the issue with Calvin. And again, you see some difference. Calvin and Knox disagreed. Calvin's position was, yeah, we see in the Bible it's not the norm, it's probably not best, it's not ideal, but there do seem to be some exceptions. There's Huldah, there's Deborah, there's some prophetesses that have a kind of rule every once in a while. And so Calvin argues, if it's acceptable to the people, and look, Parliament allows there to be a queen, and the people accept it. Look, Calvin doesn't want Mary Tudor either, but Calvin and Bullinger, they're much less dogmatic about this issue than Knox. For theological reasons, they're like, I don't think you can make just such a hard and fast rule. And for pragmatic reasons, what are you going to do? Do you want to further alienate our cause? So Knox, remember I said in 1557 he travels up to Dieppe, he's going to go to Scotland, and then this Mary Queen of Scots, who's the young queen over in France, she rescinds the invitation. I don't want John Knox coming back into my country. Well, this seems to tip him over the edge, as he thinks about female rulers. And so he writes this work, and here's a lesson for us. Unlike his other works, he did not check with his congregation of English exiles what they thought. He did not get Calvin's permission to publish it. It was published in Geneva, but with a lesser-known publisher. Calvin wouldn't have given permission. His congregation wouldn't have liked what he wrote. And the fact that Calvin didn't speak English meant that it sort of went out under the radar. The book that came out in 1558 was entitled The First Blast Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Monstrous, in this case, is the Latin meaning unnatural, and regiment, not an army, but means rule. So the first blast against the unnatural rule of women. And almost 500 years later, even fans of Knox generally agree that this was one of the great unforced errors of the Reformation. He called it the first blast because he had planned a trilogy. And he wrote to a friend that the first blast was the moderate one, and the next two, he was really going to blow the trumpet. And it was so unpopular, even with his friends, that he never got around to blowing the second and the third trumpet blast. His friend, John Fox, as in Fox's Book of Martyrs, that John Fox, so a great Protestant, wrote to Knox, Fox to Knox, it's like a Seuss book, and he complained about the tone. People today would say, tone police. Well, he was saying, look, you are making things worse for all of us. And so not only did many of his Protestant friends disagree with the theology, they thought he was just too dogmatic about it. Wasn't they thought his case was entirely wrong, just too dogmatic. They didn't agree with the tone, and the timing could not have been worse. So this comes out in the spring of 1558. By November of 1558, Bloody Mary dies, and her half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, comes to the throne. Now, Knox could not have known that Mary was about to die, but he should have known, because everyone did, that Elizabeth was going to be the next monarch. So you can imagine, he wrote this somewhat for Mary, Queen of Scots, or Mary of Guise, mostly for Mary Tudor, but she doesn't feel the brunt of it. Queen Elizabeth I does. And it's one of the sad what-ifs of Reformation history, because from that moment, Elizabeth, because this work is published in Geneva, she associates Knox with Geneva, Geneva with Calvin, Calvin with the Reformed faith, and she wants, though she's going to be a Protestant, she does not want the Reformed variety of Protestantism in England. That's all Knox. Knox thinks I'm a monster. She held a lifelong grudge against Knox and moved away from the Reformed Edward VI, Cranmer kind of Protestantism to something more latitudinarian, 1558. Well, the last part of Knox's life, if we have time to finish, was his ministry. So this was 2, sorry. And then 3 is his ministry in Scotland, which is for the rest of his life in 1559 till his death in 1572. He returns to Scotland because once Elizabeth is on the throne, Bloody Mary is gone, the English churches around the continent dry up because the English return to England or the Scots return to Scotland. Now, Scotland is a little different. England is safe for Protestants. Scotland, not quite yet. But Knox goes back and he throws himself into the reforming cause. Knox does not know any halfway measures. Here's a great paragraph, and I know we're almost out of time, but this is worth reading. This is from an Anglican bishop named John Jewell, who visited Scotland, and then he writes to Peter Martyr Vermigli. You may remember that name. That was a friend of Calvin's. He writes about what he saw in Scotland in 1559. He says, "Everything is in a ferment in Scotland. Knox is surrounded by 1,000 followers. He is holding assemblies through the whole kingdom. The old queen," so that is Mary of Guise, "has been compelled to shut herself up in a garrison." She's just hiding out in a fort. "The nobility with hearts and hands united, are restoring religion in spite of opposition. The monasteries have been leveled to the ground. Theatrical dresses, sacrilegious chalices, idols, altars are all burned to the flames. There is not a vestige of the ancient superstition and idolatry that is left. What do you ask for? Now, I'll have to explain this Greek allusion. He says, you have heard of drinking like a Scythian? Well, this is churching it like a Scythian. Remember in the Bible where Paul talks about barbarians and Scythians? So Scythians were people that the Greeks considered to be wild, uncivilized, unruly, and one of the things they were reputed for, see, the Greeks would usually water down their alcohol, and the Scythians were well known for not watering down their alcohol. So it was a saying, to drink like a Scythian was just give me the hardest stuff you got. So John Jewell says, you know what, they're churching it like Scythians up there in Scotland. This is a little wild, it's potent, it's undiluted. This is Reformation all the way. Then suddenly, in June of 1560, Mary of Guise died, which opens a window for Reformed efforts to pick up steam. Scotland had been torn apart for centuries between, do we have an alliance with England or with France? So as you can tell, it had been with the French Catholics. Now the Protestants are saying, let's get in there. Let's make sure this is an Anglo-Scottish alliance because England is Protestant now. And we want an alliance, not with the French, but with the English. And there's an opportunity here to really establish the Protestant faith. And so in 1560, Knox worked to write the Scots Confession. They famously wrote it in 4 days. He worked with 5 other Johns, Winram, Spottiswoode, Willock, Douglas, and Rowe. Great law firm. There were 6 Johns that wrote the Scots Confession. They also wrote the first book of discipline. And on August 27, 1560, the Scottish Parliament approved the Scots Confession, and Scotland officially became a Protestant nation. And if you want to date the beginning of Presbyterianism, there it is, August 27, 1560. Knox was also involved in the production of the Geneva Bible, which came out in 1560, the first English study Bible, you would say. The one dark spot in 1560 is his wife Marjorie died. She was only in her 20s. Knox would remain a widower for 3 years until he married Margaret Stuart, who was connected to this royal family, which people thought was scandalous. This commoner is marrying this royal woman. Margaret was 17, Knox was 50. Again, even a little bit scandalous by the standards of the day, but their marriage was a happy one. He often referred to Margaret as, quote, my Meg. So, we are going to have to pick up with the very end of the story next week, because I'm not quite done, but my time is up. So we are at 1560, and what happens to surprise, just to leave you with a cliffhanger, in 1561, just when the Protestants think they have won the day, finally in Scotland, Mary of Guise is dead, they establish an alliance with England, they approve the Scots Confession, which will be the confession of the Church of Scotland until it's replaced by the Westminster Confession in 1647. Just when all seems to be well, who returns? Mary, Queen of Scots. She is only a teenager, and everything from history tells us she was vivacious, clever, intelligent, beautiful, and almost 6 feet tall. She was probably taller than almost every man, and she was certainly taller than John Knox, though she was 19 years old when she returned. And if you think that her and Knox had a real great relationship, you haven't been paying attention. They didn't. So next week we will come to the rest of the story to find out the last years as Knox ministers in Scotland and the legacy that he left. So see you next week. And then to the Dutch.